Welcome back to the DYK Media podcast discussion series. In this episode, we sit down with University of Florida professor Molly Harry to discuss how the NCAA's public messaging strategies on name, image, and likeness preserve and protect NCAA regulatory power and authority. Using her 2023 article, Hegemony and the NCAA, a critical discourse analysis of NCAA resources concerning name, image, and likeness, as the framework for our discussion, Professor Harry analyzes how the NCAA communicated its power through its NIL resources and its NIL-related messaging. Professor Harry discusses the NCAA's use of hard and soft power, the NCAA's ideological influence, and NCAA coercion tactics. She also explains the NCAA's decentralization of power in communications that shifted control to member institutions of NIL issues, and also by requesting federal intervention on NIL. Professor Harry is an assistant professor of sports management at the University of Florida. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Florida, her master's in sports administration from the University of North Carolina, and her doctorate in higher education from the University of Virginia. Good morning, Professor Harry, and welcome to the DYK podcast. I've really been looking forward to this discussion and so happy that you could join us this morning.
Yes, thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and talk hegemony and the NCAA.
It's a big topic.
Yeah.
I was really pleased to have the opportunity to meet you in March at the College Sports Research Institute conference, the annual conference. And I sat in on your plenary address, and it was titled Humanity in Education and Sport, the Human Athlete. And you were recognized as an emerging young scholar at CSRI. And I loved what you had to say. I took notes. And I wanted to use that discussion really as a template for you to talk about how you got into college sports related scholarship, what influenced you, and how you see your work and where it fits into the broader debate over athletes' rights and understanding what's really happening at the values level. And that's what I loved about your talk. You were speaking values.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was an incredible honor. I love CSRI. That was my sixth one. So to be recognized there was a really great honor and privilege. But my research in sport or interest in sport really emerged. I grew up playing sports, and it was a way for me to bond with my dad and things like that. And he's a former sports journalist. My mom's an editor. So the ability to study sports, combine school that I found out that I loved and was good at an early age into this hopefully lifelong career of researching and being a professor is something that I'm really excited about. I think a little bit about my evolution as a thinker in this space, I suppose. I think I started off like most Americans in this collegiate sport model, really believing in its grand aspects, the amateurism, the student athletes. They are students first and foremost. They can and should do it all really well. Competitive equity, this fairness ideal. I really believed in that. And then going in through my undergrad, and then once I hit my master's and PhD at UNC and UVA respectively, I was really exposed to more critical scholarship in sport management or sports related areas. Reading Nocera's and Strauss's Indentured was really key for me. And then also Cheated by Smith and Willingham, understanding that UNC academic athletic scandal and unpacking that student athlete component, right? And how much are they really students in some of these instances? And really my mind was blown, and it was a really important times in my scholarly development, I suppose, to be exposed to some of those critical pieces that, there are many great positives that come with college athletics and participation, but there's so much more that are negative that we can do better and address, but we have to have that critical perspective. So reading some of those works were really key. Dr. Richard Southall, Ellen Stewarski's work, really informative as well. Also reading the works of Dr. Keith Harrison, Dr. Joey Cooper, Dr. AJ Keaton, all these people who are adding a racial lens to this as well is something that, as a white woman from a middle-class background, wasn't really something I thought much about, to be honest, and something that really, I think, took my scholarship to the next level, took me as an advocate to the next level, hopefully, and I found really important. And I think, too, it's an uncomfortable thing to be like, I didn't think about race or gender or all these other things going on, but it's important that we acknowledge that. because by me hopefully acknowledging my evolution and my growth and my ability to acknowledge some of these things can help future scholars do that as well, and future individuals. We can only grow by reading and challenging ourselves, and I have found that to be really important for me personally.
Yeah, you mentioned some heavy hitters
Yeah.
in the community on athletes' rights, and I love what Professor Southall and Professor Strowski have done. And you went to the University of Florida as an undergrad, then
Yep.
UNC for a master's, UVA for your doctorate, and those are all Power Four schools. They're also among the top 10 ranked public universities, kind of the public ID profile.
Yeah.
As you've moved along, you're at University of Arkansas right now. You're going to be going back home to the University of
Yes.
Florida. I know that's an
Yeah.
exciting transition, and congratulations
Totally.
on that.
Thank you.
At a Power Four university, do you sense that your scholarship now, particularly speaking to provocative issues like
Mhm.
race and exploitation and the fairness of the business model, do you get any pushback from either students or administrators or the community? Do you feel like you're in a pretty good space at those institutions to talk honestly about how you see these things?
Yeah, I think, I was just getting my gears going at UNC and UVA, and those have some really tense history with race,
Hmm.
particularly. Florida has its own issues as well, politically, as the state, but being as I'm not there, I can't speak to that necessarily. I was told in my interviews that the research I want to do, this diversity and this really equity minded civil rights piece, will be respected and valued there. So I'm excited to continue that work. Arkansas has been very accepting of this and has funded very critical scholarship in my time here, which I've been very appreciative of. But I think UVA and UNC, they have a lot of this history, the Silent Sam statue and
Hmm.
ripping that down, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, its history, which happened the year before I came there. The ramifications of that rally are just I get chills thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
They're resounding still on that campus with its racial history too. And I do think they do cultivate spaces to have those conversations. There are certainly some students and other faculty who don't want to acknowledge it or have that pushback, but all opinions are welcome. That we are in this space to challenge and grow. And I think that those institutions are on their way to perhaps providing space where we can really push it forward a little bit more when it comes to critical scholarship, and also critical scholarship when it comes to sports as
Yeah,
well.
that's great to hear. But you talk in terms of power structures, and we're going to get to a really important paper that you published in December to really drill down on that. But universities, particularly the big time Power Four universities who are in the big time college sports sweepstakes, are so concerned about marketing and branding. The brand is everything. And you touch on that really, I think, in that article, in terms of how the power structures want to preserve a certain image that's tied to the mythology that you mentioned. And I think that it'll be interesting to see, as your scholarship evolves, your career develops, whether you see some of those same power structure influences at the institutional level that are very subtle, but can influence climate and culture.
Absolutely. I'm excited to get to the University of Florida and start to explore those two. I think having it be an alma mater of mine adds a little extra critical. You love it, and you're both really hypercritical of it at the same time. So it'll
Yeah.
be an interesting time for me adjusting to that.
Yeah. I have that same kind of relationship with my alma mater, Duke. So could you talk a little bit about how you see yourself as a female scholar in this space? Because I think you're in a pretty small group
Yeah.
as a woman who is challenging the power structure through a lens that is outside of the typical Title IX framework. You're looking at the racial
Yeah.
implications. How do you see yourself as a female scholar, and who do you look to as kind of mentors? And do you feel like you're a voice in the wilderness?
Sometimes, right? Sometimes I feel a little bit that way. I think being a woman scholar, women's voices have been marginalized or even silenced a lot of the times when in higher ed spaces too,
Hmm.
and in sport. We're at this nexus, particularly with the research I'm doing with the higher ed and sport intersection. You're not just marginalized in sports, you're marginalized when it comes to education, and
Right.
have been for decades. So let's combine the two perhaps most marginalized spaces for women and say, go out there and be successful. So I feel really great having the mentors that I've had. Dr. Arian Waite was my advisor at UNC, and she really helped pave the way for respecting me as a person too. And I think that's one of the perhaps maybe a gender stereotype that I think many women scholars still have. That's a positive. We are nurturing, we care about our women, and we will support our women. And that is something that I've really felt in the community of women scholars I've been able to build up. Dr. Ellen Swarsky, who I've met multiple times at CSRI, always comes up, always remembers what you've said to her previously, to build that camaraderie that we have to continue to push our agenda forward. I think you sort of alluded to it with this Title IX piece. I do a lot of work in Title IX. I'm passionate about that as well. But I think a lot of times women scholars are maybe siloed intentionally or unintentionally into studying only women's sports. Part of that is me search. I want to study, what I've gone through. That's great. But we need our voices heard there because we lived it, we breathed it, that we are experts in that. But we need women's voices outside of that, studying football that we can't play. Just because we didn't play football doesn't mean we don't understand it, and doesn't mean we don't understand all of the issues that are going on surrounding the power for football. But I'm really excited to be hopefully getting a crew together to sort of tackle this equity piece, this racial lens going forward. So
Yeah, and the reason I mentioned that, Professor Harry, is that in this congressional debate, and you've spent some time looking at what's happened in Congress, the Title IX issue has come up really as a wedge issue through the lobbying campaign. And you've had people in Congress and NCAA people testifying in Congress, making the suggestion that if we do anything to address the civil rights implications of the business model for African-American laborers in football and men's basketball, then somehow we're harming the interests of women and the interests of Title IX. And I have argued that that's a divisive narrative, and there's plenty of money and plenty of equity to go around. We can address both issues,
right.
And it doesn't have to be this one or the other. And that binary is a real problem. Do you see a space to talk about those two things at the same time? Or do you look at female scholars, in that siloed effect that you talked about, do you feel like there's kind of invisible inertia towards looking at it primarily through the Title IX and gender equity lens?
I think kind of with what you're saying with this divisive binary, I think that goes back a little bit to the language that we're using that we'll get into a little bit too later on. But I like you said, there's too many resources, and also there's too much brain power. You mean to tell me of the thousands of administrators working in the NCAA and the thousands of faculty members that we can't come together and find a model? I'll sign up, I'll serve on a committee, and I'll work to do that, because I think it's an and. Women and men and however anybody identifies can be involved in creating this new, more equitable model. It's not an or topic, in my opinion. And I think it's often framed that way for perhaps political agendas and other self-interests. So I'm a big proponent of bringing in everybody to really solve this issue. And I think we'll get there. I just hope we get there sooner than later.
So that'll be a great segue into a paper that you wrote and published in December, just a few months ago. The title of the article is Hegemony and the National Collegiate Athletic Association, a critical discourse analysis of National Collegiate Athletic Association resources concerning name, image, and likeness. That is a mouthful.
Quite a title. Well, per APA standards, you can't abbreviate.
But beneath that title are some really important values-based arguments and some universal principles about how power structures assert their influence and get their way. And you framed that paper through the lens of hegemony and hegemony theory. And a lot of people may not know what those are. If you could talk just at the 30,000 foot level about what the thrust of your paper was, what led you to use this analysis.
Sure. So hegemony is just the process of gaining or maintaining power by the consent and approval of those who are being led or controlled, if you will. So in this case, that might be the NCAA, who are gaining consent from member institutions and member institution stakeholders, coaches, athletes, administrators, all of those sorts of things. So hegemony theory was done by Antonio Gramsci, who was fighting the Italian fascist regime in the 1920s. And so he created this sort of framework. It's been used in sport management literature before, sociology literature, certainly. So it emerged from there, and I've seen it used. And I thought it was really interesting sort of perspective that the power within it is something that's really important in understanding what the NCAA is and where it's headed or where it's not headed, right? So there's a few elements to hegemony theory. So the way Gramsci described it was this ruling class and their power over the working class. And in this paper, I sort of couch the ruling class as this NCAA, which is going to really be the national office and those lead officers that are making these decisions. Mark Emmert, Charlie Baker, chief financial officers, lawyers, things of that nature. And then the working class more, of course, the athletes, but also even sometimes the membership with the administrators and coaches. What I think is really interesting and something that's maybe a little bit more of an extension and a nuanced perspective with the way I looked at hegemony was that coaches and administrators, because they serve on committees and things like that, they waffle between the working class and the ruling class. So if I'm on this committee and I'm making a decision to implement name, image, likeness, for example, or to change the recruiting dead period, whatever it might be, I have some power. So I'm able to enact that in that sort of way. But I've already consented to be a part of the NCAA. So if they create a ruling that I don't like, prior to all the court cases that we're seeing, sort of this resurgence of power being restructured, which is also part of hegemony theory. In times where there's uncertainty, like right now with NIL, we start to see power dynamics shift. So, but when coaches consent or athletics directors consent to being a part of the membership, they agree to take on those maybe violations or punishments from the NCAA or whatever regulations that are being passed down from the governing body there. And then former, I believe, Secretary of State for the US created this idea of hard power and soft power, which I also incorporated into the paper. Hard power is going to be this coercion piece, historically seen through military or economic power. So military power, not so much with the NCAA, but you can, if you think about it in a more maybe creative way, with the bylaws and the compliance that we have to follow and all of those things are a little bit militaristic with that. And then the economic power, the NCAA, we know, makes $1 billion, and that gives them a lot of power to implement those policies and to encourage people to continue to consent and agree to be ruled by the hegemon that is the NCAA. And then the soft power, which I think is perhaps maybe the most fascinating part, is this values, the culture that's created and maintained that's passed from the ruling class down to the working class. That has historically been seen as one of the biggest ones with amateurism, with that ideology that's been maintained for over a century. So
yeah, so that's
a little bit
interesting.
about hegemony.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about that hard soft power and then some of the historical analogs and the academic frameworks. Gramsci in the 1920s is opposing fascism and trying to tease out how fascist regimes influence the people that are subject to their authority. With the NCAA, you have this soft power component, and they've portrayed themselves as a benevolent nonprofit institution. And a lot of these values run through and appeal to our sense of concern and even paternalism over caring for these athletes. But when you look behind that at what they're actually trying to accomplish, for example, in their public messaging on NIL and what they're trying to do in Congress, there's a disguised motive there, I believe, that really is driven by their commercial interests. And so you have a behind the scenes hard power way of thinking, but for public purposes. And the way they externalize that message, it's really a benevolent soft power approach. And did you see that distinction in the kind of the duality of the way that the NCAA messages to various decision makers and stakeholders?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's that soft power that's able to maintain the hard power in a lot of ways, which as I was combing through the documents I was examining, that really emerged. And as I was analyzing them a little bit more, I found that to be probably one of the big takeaways. You have these two powers, the hard and soft power, perhaps operating simultaneously by themselves. But when I think they're strongest is that Venn diagram where they intersect. And that definitely came through. And I think we're starting to see more of that challenge in the scholarship and in just day-to-day water cooler conversations pop up as well.
So I want to talk a little bit about the framework that you used.
Yeah.
And so you used the name, image, and likeness context. You took 48 pieces of published messaging. All of it was from the NCAA.
It was, yep.
And you analyzed that through this critical discourse analysis to try to tease out how that messaging aligned with the powers of the hegemon and the tactics that they use. Could you talk a little bit about the structural framework, CDA and
Yeah.
then the name, image, and likeness context and what led you to that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So discourse is just the strategic synthetic use of language to express ways of knowing, to express values. And then the critical way is saying, okay, what's really being conveyed in this language and taking it one step further. I think looking at discourse is really important because our language creates our reality.
Hmm.
If I'm just like looking at myself, if I look in the mirror and each time I say I need to lose weight, I need to lose weight, that becomes my reality. My language becomes what I believe. The same way the NCAA has said we're an amateur body, athletes are amateurs. We have started to believe that, and that's really seeped into the culture of American college sports. So discourse is linked to reality, which I think is really important and something that maybe we take for granted on a day-to-day basis. But critical discourse, again, adds that perspective and connects it more to these inequalities and power dynamics and policies, practices that are maintaining a status quo that inherently benefits, in this case, a ruling class over a working class. Power is a resource, or language, is a power resource. And I think this CDA, critical discourse analysis, really exposes that. And it can be intentional, it can be perhaps a little more implicit in nature as well. So I connected language to how the NCAA language to how they've maintained their power for so long. So like you alluded to, I looked at 48 documents released on the NCAA's Taking Action website. They were done from 2019 to 2022. And they began with like the NCAA releasing a statement saying, hey, California, if you do this, your athletes can't compete in our championships and we're going to pull funding. And stuff's going to hit the fan. And it ranged to the more recent 2022 policies that the NCAA had released for NIL and how athletics departments could provide education to athletes and how they could engage with NIL collectives and things like that. But other documents were statements released by the NCAA countering other bills, Senate testimonies, the Board of Governors report on what they're doing to challenge NIL or to find a solution to the issue that's NIL. So those were some of the example documents that I examined. And again, these were all publicly available, and the NCAA was promoting this webpage as here's what we're doing to address this issue. And here's where institutions, coaches, administrators, athletes can go if they have some questions about this. There are also a handful of videos as well.
So you mentioned the opposition to the California SB 206, the California Name, Image, and Likeness Law, when that was first proposed in February of 2019. And then you had all this positioning after that, leading into the NCAA's congressional debate. And you had some hard power examples there.
Yeah.
Not only were they threatening to rule California athletes ineligible, they were threatening to sue the state of California under a dormant commerce clause theory. And so you've had this conditional messaging on name, image, and likeness. And they came to use that messaging to say, yeah, we support NIL, but, and on the other side of that but were a lot of these tactics of the hegemon. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then under CDA, how you categorize the types of messages. So you have a chart called the elements of power and resources, and you break out the type of messaging and what theme it went to really show how purposeful some of this messaging was. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in reading through the documents, I took just this first lens of, okay, what's happening here? Reading just for context and what the NCAA was saying more on the superficial level. Then making it the critical discourse analysis, not just discourse analysis, adding that critical perspective. Well, what's really being said behind these documents, these videos, whatever it might be, and then connecting that again to the power structures and who is having the power or who is losing the power in some instances as well. So that's sort of how this is all linked back to that hegemony theory. And then through that analysis, like you alluded to, breaking it down into, okay, here, what are the examples of hard power that are coming through? How many of these documents have that sort of quality? How many are focused more on the soft power, this ideological influence that the NCAA is trying to maintain over American college sports? And then finally, in reality, the NCAA is and has been losing a lot of power. So I looked at it more on this, how is the governing body maybe flailing in a lot of ways there. So the documents were analyzed to fall into sort of these three buckets, which some subcomponents, which I'm sure we'll get into here too.
Yeah, I'm looking at the table. It's in your paper, and it's
Yep.
really interesting just to see it broken out in black and white. You mentioned how subtle this messaging is and how it's just not even conscious. And that's one of the powers of hegemonic authority. It just becomes a secondary cultural value through spontaneous consent. The term student athlete's a good example of that. We say it just rolls off our tongue. We don't really think about the history, but you have ideological influence, coercion, and losing dominance. And you took the 48 papers and then you looked at how each of those tools were used throughout the 48 papers. And under ideological influence of the 48 papers, you found that in 47 cases, there was some form of values-based, mythology-based, ideologically based messaging. And can you talk a little bit about that? And then maybe some of the subcategories of ideological influence that you thought were particularly pervasive and effective?
Yeah, I think I wasn't expecting ideological influence to be so prominent,
Hmm.
to be honest. I was really thinking it was going to be more of the NCAA hard power would be what would emerge over the documents or the resources that they release. And that really wasn't the case. But reflectively, this makes much more sense. But when I started the process, I thought something differently there. But yeah, so the most common was fairness for all. And this really centered around the idea of equity in preventing NIL inducements, particularly when it came through recruiting. And of course, that conversation happened early on in 2019 with that first document and was maintained through a lot of the documents throughout the span of collection up to 2022. And we know today that that's probably still one of the biggest issues people have with NIL serving as a potential recruiting inducement. So the NCAA would release statements or Emmert would testify to the Senate, whatever it might be, saying with NIL now, there's no equity. Well, has there really been equity in recruiting to begin with? We have scandals about recruiting that pop up all the time. And we know that what Alabama can do for a recruit is going to look different than what South Alabama can do for a recruit too. So there's never really been that equity there that I think the NCAA has tried to promote, I should say. The idea of fair competition too was something that was really prominent throughout the documents there. If NIL would create less fair competition, right? All these rosters are going to be stacked, and then all of these other rosters are not going to have the great athletes. And we already know that athletes, again, they want to go to the Alabamas of the world first. And then maybe if there's another opportunity down the line, if they can't get that Alabama gig, they'll go to the South Alabama instead. So again, this fair competition just hasn't existed. And Ramogi Huma's statement really challenges. That's one of the documents there for that's released on the website as well, challenging this idea of fairness that's never really existed. And then one of the ones that I thought was really interesting, and it sort of dissipated over time. There's a few of these themes that go away a little bit, but treating athletes the same as non-athletes unless a compelling reason exists to differentiate.
Compelling.
Well, and that's the language that the NCAA used in that statement. Well, athletes aren't like non-athletes in a lot of ways. And you use the term student athlete to sort of harken back that they are like them. But by having athletes sign away their NIL rights to begin with, you've already differentiated them from non-athletes. So the irony is giving them back their NIL rights actually goes to that point of not treating them any differently. So there is a little bit of irony there that I thought really important to point out. I personally thought too, the ideological influence that amateurism would have been more prominent than fairness, and that ended up not being the case. And I think over time, we see that amateurism, that term, goes away a little bit in the messaging that the NCAA is using and releasing, likely due to the growing disdain for that term amateurism. People were starting to push back and be like, I don't see how the starting quarterback's an amateur, or I don't see how with NIL you can call them an amateur. It's too akin to pay for play, whatever it might be. So that was one of those findings there.
You hit on the two that I really wanted to talk about. And I love that example about treating athletes the same as non-athletes. And early on in the work of this federal and state legislation working group and the messaging that came from then NCAA Board of Governors Chair, Dr. Michael Drake, and some of the other spokespeople, that was an important point. And the message there was that this is an equity-based approach for us. This NIL thing is about getting these athletes the ability to be treated as non-athletes, unless there's a compelling reason to do otherwise, to treat them differently. And the compelling reason was amateurism. So you had this Orwellian formulation this principle that was designed to try, in their view, to publicly promote nil. But then the comma, what comes after the comma, brings us back to a principle that makes meaningful nil compensation impossible. Bringing in
and that's the
amateurism.
language.
Right.
That's why the language is so important. Like, hey, if you just read this first part of the sentence, you think one thing, but there's always a comma, but and a comma, however, or whatever it is. So I think that just speaks to the importance of understanding the language that we are using, but that the NCAA is using.
And then on amateurism, it's such a great point that you raised, that early in the discussion in 2019, the A word was ubiquitous. And a lot of the initial bills that came out of Congress, like Jerry Moran's initial bill in 2021, had amateur in the title. A lot of the bills specifically spoke in terms of preserving amateurism. And then as the debate evolved and some of these external pressures were coming in through federal lawsuits, through administrative agencies, state legislatures, you started to see this shift in language away from amateurism. And you pointed out, I believe that you were talking about the new NCAA Constitution that was ratified in January of 2022. The word amateur doesn't appear once in that Constitution.
Yeah.
But the student athlete is everywhere. So you have this dual messaging. And then they came up with something called the student athlete
Collegiate model, I think.
Collegiate model, right. Which was a substitute for amateurism. They just weren't using the A word. Could you talk a little bit about how that tactic, as a kind of a language positioning tactic, is used by the hegemon, in this case, the NCAA? And do you think it's been effective?
Perhaps a little effective. Again, I think more and more people are perhaps a little more skeptical of amateurism and of, again, that is the strategic use of discourse to say, okay, we're not going to use amateurism in our constitution or in our later messaging. But hey, if you go into the NCAA manual, bylaw 12 still exists and that says amateurism. So it's fascinating that it's a little bit of mixed messaging that we're talking about here. And also, if you're going to refer to the student athlete, that still has that ring of amateurism as well. It's just not in your face. It is that more subtle, implicit amateurism that they're referring to as well. And I think too, that continues to sort of, what I think that does a few things. That continues to have people in their consciousness think, okay, college athletics is also still about college if we're calling them student athletes. It still has that education ring to it. I also think not a lot of people know the history of the term student athlete, and they see this as, again, appreciating the dueling roles that college athletes have. They go to class, they're involved in their group work and homework and all those things, go to tutoring, and they're competing on their fields, courts, in the pool, whatever it is. So I think it does a little bit of both, but we unpack the term student athlete. We know that that's a little bit fraudulent and sketchy to be using that term as well. So I think it is a replacement. So the consciousness on amateurism has been raised across perhaps America, or people who care about college athletics. I don't think the consciousness about the history of the term student athlete has been raised, and that's why they're able to still use that. I think there's a growing conversation about that. But it hasn't reached that inflection point that amateurism has, in my opinion.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the history of the student athlete and how it was devised? And then it really, on this employee issue, so one of the key issues in Congress right now and in the public debate now is whether certain classes of athletes should be employees. We have some administrative agency action through the National Labor Relations Board, but the student athlete was devised for a cynical purpose. And it has come to be an expression of amateur purity. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then how a concept like this, and you referred to this earlier, you alluded to this earlier, of these mythology principles acquiring a secondary cultural value that's independent of their history.
Yeah, I think that's, okay. I'll start with the history of the term and then get into that. But it started in the 1950s. Ray Dennison is a football player. He receives a blow to a head. At this time, he's a recipient of a GI Bill, I believe. So he's a little bit older. He has a wife and 3 children at the time. He ends up passing away from that skull fracture that he received while playing football. His wife files believing he's an employee of Fort Lewis A&M, of the institution he's competing for. Well, the NCAA and the lawyer team takes exception to this because they see this as potentially dangerous economically going forward. If they pay death benefits, employee benefits out and pay this widow of Ray Dennison, then they're going to have to pay future athletes who might be in similar situations, or it might turn into this employee model instead of this amateur model that they are still trying to promote in the 1950s. So they take them to court and the court ends up ruling in favor of the NCAA. And the term student athlete is what they use to say, hey, he's not an employee because he's a student.
Mhm.
It's sort of this cyclical argument that they're able to really capitalize on. And from there, it takes off in the vernacular. When we start to discuss college sport, we start to say they are student athletes. And Walter Byers, in his memoir, notes the issues with that. Ellen Stewarski and Richard Southall have a great paper, Cheering the Collegiate Model, that unpacks that a little bit more too. So does Alan Sack and his work with those folks too. This isn't necessarily a new conversation. It is something that I think we need to continue to revisit because it has been used to deny rights to athletes, and it has been cited in court cases. The 1984 Oklahoma v. NCAA, it's been cited in previous ones or future ones after that as well as reasons why athletes should not be paid, and because they're amateurs, because they are student athletes. It's a little bit of that unknown history there. And kudos to Walter Byers for saying, hey, I kind of messed up with this one. It's actually an issue. And I think if the guy who created the term and who led this organization says, hey, I messed up, we might ought to listen a little more and change it. So
Yeah. And there have been 12 congressional hearings over the last 4 years. And it wasn't until the most recent hearing on March 12th that student athlete fraud was put on the table and dissected. And Mark Gaston Pierce, former member of the National Labor Relations Board, the national body, he went through the history. And what was interesting to me about that is that one of the members of the committee said, I had no idea. So we've been having this debate for 4 years. And at the end of it, you have legislators who are being asked to make some very important policy decisions who don't even know the history of the term. And that speaks to its power. Yeah.
It does. It speaks to the power that term has been able to run away with. And I think to give power, the NCAA requesting federal involvement with this decentralization, that was one of the findings from the paper as well. I think signals, it's just odd. You want these individuals who don't know the history of the term student athlete. I mean, you still had senators, the January hearing of this year say that Alston's the reason we have NIL, and you want them to take control over perhaps one of the biggest changes in college sport history. To me, that doesn't make sense, but that is a huge signal of the NCAA conceding its power. But to answer your question on mythologies earlier, I think the myths of the student athlete, amateurism, competitive equity, all those things I said I believed way back when, I think they're the reason why the NCAA has really been able to survive and thrive for so long. And because we are having these conversations and others are having these conversations, we're starting to see, again, this uncertainty really start to challenge the hegemon that is the NCAA.
So in looking at these three categories, ideological influence, coercion, losing dominance, which goes into decentralization, which I want to talk about, the ideological influence was way more prevalent. The coercion piece, and looking at these 48 messages, that was not as powerful and as present. What's your thinking on that? Do you think it's because the NCAA understands the power of the ideology, or do you think that they, through losing some power from these external regulatory influences, their coercive threat is less than it was in the past?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all of those things. I think the amateurism has just such this evoking passion and emotion and pride that people have with their institution, with the student athletes. I'm guilty of it too, that rep the orange and blue, that I think bleed orange and blue, and that might not be the case, and that's okay. Took me a while to get there with that evolution, but that's fine. So I think there's a little bit of this ideological influence is really powerful. Let's lean into that space. I think they realized too that the threats weren't really working. States were just coming in hot, firing those bills after California. Like, they released the challenge to Senate Bill 206, and the next day there's another state bill. So it wasn't working. And I think that's why coercion ended up being a lot less prevalent than the ideological influence. And that sort of shaped the NCAA's agenda with how they were going to send out the messaging when it came to name, image, and likeness. I think the biggest one was that economic intimidation. And that's one of the ones that I personally have the biggest issue. Money is power. Money rules the world. So to threaten to threatened to pull opportunities for California to receive funding from the NCAA because you're not hosting championships, whatever it might be, and you're threatening the experiences of athletes you say to value, those 24,000 athletes who won't be able to participate, and you're going to threaten to not support California anymore and their institutions, and therefore they cannot support their athletes. To me, that's perhaps the most egregious example of saying, hey, we love our athletes, we support them, we want them to participate in educational developmental opportunities that are sport, and yet we're not going to help you here.
So let's talk then a little bit about this losing dominance, the decentralization principle. If you could talk about how you see that, and it's kind of the, I guess, the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain. Is like, you don't know who's really behind the curtain. They have more power. And I think the curtain's been pulled back a little bit through some of these external regulatory threats. Can you talk about how the NCAA managed that through this decentralization principle?
Yeah, so that was the second biggest common theme through the papers was this decentralization. So 75% of the documents noted some type of decentralization. And I think that really paints the picture of what was happening in the NCAA during the time of the document analysis and the data collection that I was doing, where all these court cases were either starting to come to an end or more were being filed. And so the NCAA was in these power struggles and had no choice but to perhaps consider decentralization and finding other means to maintain power, such as through advocating for federal preemption, having that unified law across the board so that athletes in Missouri have the same rights as Florida, as California, whatever it might be. I think here with the decentralization, what's really important is that the NCAA, rather than shouldering the burden, and we had Gene Smith and a few other people who were on the NIL committee say, hey, we put forward actually kind of rigorous guidelines, and the people above us said no. And that was a really big conversation, I think last year at some point, maybe the year before, because when the NCAA does give the go-ahead for NIL, there's only 5 guidelines, and they're vague and they're short and they're not all that helpful for administrators looking to maybe keep things equitable or try to, or implement fair policies, whatever it might be. But I think what was the biggest finding for here is they really shifted the onus of NIL and understanding NIL and educating athletes to the conferences, institutions, and athletics departments, and even the athletes themselves. And again, if you're going to call them kids and student athletes and all these things, but you're not going to help educate them, I don't think it can be both of those things. So to not provide the resources to your institutions who are there to support the athletes, hopefully, a little bit problematic in my view, but that's also strategic. They mention in one of the documents is a handout for athletes, and it has this athlete image in the center, and it's the athlete should do this and this and this and this. And I'm like, all in the 20 hours that they're allowed for college athletics participation. And you want them to also understand all of these different things. You want them to read the state law on NIL and all of this. So it is really interesting to think about, but that's strategic, because when now we're all complaining, the media is complaining, coaches are complaining, they could say, hey, we gave some policies. Hey, that's actually up to the institution. Hey, we're trying to get the federal government involved, but we can't, or they're not moving as fast as we want them to. It's taking too much time. That's not on us. We're doing the best that we can. So again, I think that's the strategic use of language that the NCAA was doing.
Yeah, and you talked about the interim policy. That's a temporary policy by its very definition. And it's interim until what? Either the NCAA changes its own rules, which it has not. It hasn't changed a word of the bylaws that relate to name, image, and likeness. They've issued guidance, but it's vague. And then they've had some supplemental guidance, which I think confused the issue. But more importantly, it's interim until what? Until Congress intervenes. And then they were going to Congress to restore some of their hegemonic power. So you had this really interesting dance where they're ceding authority by this nil dump on the institutions.
Yes.
While the condition for that temporary market is reclaiming that power through Congress. Did you see that dual messaging and kind of this behind the scenes movement to they're decentralizing, but they want to reclaim their authority at the same time through the powers of the federal government?
Yeah, I think that was maybe one of the things I found most perplexing is they're trying to do both. And I don't necessarily, using the federal government as a way to maintain power while also giving the federal government power over you is a little bit confusing, in my opinion. I also think it shows really a lack of forethought and planning throughout this process. And one of the themes is that the NCAA needs more time to navigate this. And I say this to my students, I say this to anybody, I'll talk to anybody about this, but I'm like, you had time. You've had decades of time to figure this out. NIL has always been a thing, and it's just a matter of time before those pressures came, and then you sat on your hands a little too long to be successful in that. So I think that duality of let's maintain our power while also having somebody help us give power. In politicians, we've alluded to it a little bit in the podcast, but they're hesitant. They're a little skeptical of the NCAA and helping out the NCAA. And there's so many other issues that maybe the federal government wants to or needs to focus on. So of course they're going to take their time. And one of the hearings I was listening to, one of the politicians was like, to change this would take an act of Congress. If we were to pass a nationwide bill, then to undo what you want us to do, if something else massive changes, takes an act of Congress. And it's already taken us years to get to this point. How long would that next thing take? So I think it's really interesting. And again, to me, it just signals a really poor lack of planning and forethought by the NCAA leaders.
Yeah, so that brings me to something else you raised in the article, which is really important. And this is sort of I've referred to it as kind of the promise and delay tactic that the NCAA has employed over time. But you talk about their use of modernization and change. And some of the initial messaging that came out from the NCAA in 2019 was, we're going to modernize. It's time. The time is now to modernize. Could you talk about that as a tactic and then where that kind of fit into your model?
Yeah, modernization was definitely bigger in the beginning. And then I think they realized they weren't really modernizing the way that when I hear the term modernize, I think maybe an implosion and something really cool happening, and that they weren't really tackling it in the way that I think, again, that their language was maybe communicating. And so over time, that idea of modernization dissipated. But I think that use of the language of the terms modernization, of change and collaboration, even working with the federal government, working with campuses and all that, really paints this picture that we're doing a lot of work. And then to have Gene Smith and to have then those 5 really vague policy options there shows that this isn't really the modernization. And I think too, the NCAA has been forced to modernize over time. It hasn't, and Diane Caller talks about this in the Senate hearing that she testifies in. All the changes that come in the NCAA aren't often through the NCAA itself. They're from an outside sort of uproar and issue. With Shabazz Napier in 2014 saying, "I go to bed hungry," then we get the change. It wasn't the NCAA being like, oh, peanut butter on a bagel, we have bigger fish to fry, let's just feed the athletes, let's give them the food that they need to compete, and also to like not be hungry in class, and to be able to concentrate and be that student that you want them to be. So all of these issues, the same way if we think about a bigger case with O'Bannon, all these things are the reason the NCAA modernizes isn't because it really wants to, it's because it's forced to. And a lot of the time, I think Charlie Baker has tried to maybe move the needle in some of those instances with his Project D1, I think is what people have started calling his proposal, but it doesn't go far enough. And I think that's the part that people like me and you perhaps have issues with. If you're going to modernize, let's go ahead and do the dang thing.
Yes, I agree. And, my initial reaction to that Project D1, I put it into the promise and delay category until proven otherwise, right? Because the history doesn't suggest that the NCAA or the Power Four are serious about modernization and real change. In this decentralization model of the NCAA sort of ceding its power to Congress, really, and then to free markets through the interim policy, did you see at the voluntary regulatory level a shift more towards Power Four dominance? And are they really now the behind the scenes hegemon rather than the NCAA?
Yeah, I don't think that came through really in the documents. I think we've seen that in subsequently with developments with NIL and Power Four just being top of mind. They're the biggest schools, most commercialized. Their athletics directors and conference commissioners are the loudest. They're also often overrepresented in the conversations about NIL, which is going to continue to give them that power too. And I think that's really important. I think we will see the hegemon powers shift, if not already shifting towards the Power Four conferences at this point, right? Greg Sankey's a very powerful man. Tony Petitti, a very powerful man. I'd love to say there's a powerful woman in this mix too, hopefully soon, one of these days here. But yeah, I think it is shifting. And again, those are going to be the people in my mind who do end up modernizing things. Again, it's a little slow modernization process that we're in the middle of. I think too, again, in centering the athletes, they're not in these conversations enough, particularly those who have been exploited the most. It took 11 hearings for us to get Chase Griffin to testify. Well, why is there not a Power 5 quarterback, a Power 5 center, men's basketball player? Where are they? We need their voices. So to modernize without having athletes at the table, I think would also just someone else will be hosting this podcast in 150 years having the same conversation. And it can't just be those 3 athletes, the 10 athletes, like that doesn't do it for me. I want a full-blown strategized way to modernize with athletes' voices at the center of it. And of course, athletes aren't a monolith. We can see that in the Senate and House hearings where Kiki Thole testifies to something completely different than what Chase Griffin wants. Well, that's part of why scholars and practitioners should be trying to bring this together.
That's why I think your paper is so powerful, because you found a way to frame some of these abstract principles in a way that at some level quantifies the messaging. And I think that's a real challenge. And we take these anecdotal pieces, but I think that there are a lot of people who intuitively think something doesn't make sense here, but they don't think about it critically the way that you have and structured it in a way that says, yeah, I can take that comment and put it into one of the pieces of the puzzle that Professor Harry laid out. Do you see this framework being valuable going forward and looking back, but also what might happen in terms of the messaging and how it's changed and how powerful it is at the mythology level?
Yeah, thank you. I think definitely I love CDA. I love hegemony. I think this combo is just really important, and even other power frameworks we can get into and incorporating that. I think, like you mentioned, this qualitative, quantitative hybrid, people inherently understand numbers. We understand that a team that scores 50 and the other team scores 49, well, the team who scored 50 wins. The same way with quantifying. Well, I can go find my notes and tell you exactly how many times amateurism was used in these documents. I can go ahead and tell you how many times that literally the NCAA said, we are decentralizing now. So I think that helps people really understand a little bit more. It's not as nebulous, perhaps, as true qualitative work is. But I think the use of the power frameworks and discourse analysis is really helpful in framing how the media is framing, how are politicians. You alluded to the idea that amateurism was referenced in bills early on, and that went away too. So we can really start to see sort of this power shift in different parts of college sport, which I think makes this framework and the method of CDA really important and really a great opportunity to use going forward, for sure.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about right now is so important. I've argued this from the very beginning. And from the very beginning of my writing and then my podcasting, I said, we have to change the way that we feel about college sports. And so much of the way we feel has been influenced by the mythology. And nothing's going to change as long as the people who created this mess are still sitting in decision-making chairs being charged to solve it. And that's where we are right now. So I want to have that as a segue into what was your conclusion? What do you see right now? What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of years in the context of this shifting power structure and where the NCAA and the Power Four will fit in?
Yeah, I think at some point, I think the NCAA will continue to exist. I think it's just going to look very different. I think there's potential for really a separate autonomous division if the Power Four does want to go that route, or for the Power Four. I don't know about a super league. I've done some reading on that. I can see it and I also can't see it. So I think that the power is really going to change. I think in taking sort of this activism, justice, equity approach, I really think the lack of empathy towards athletes and their experiences is honestly part of the issue, and maybe at the heart of the issue. We see these athletes as greedy, money-hungry kids, and they're rather than the human beings that they are. Well, I made my decisions to go to my schools based off of money too. Does that make me greedy and money-hungry? I don't think so. It just allowed me to graduate without debt. Heaven forbid that happens. So I think in reframing and shifting our perspective of athletes will really help us understand the future of college sports a little better. We have college athletics because we have college athletes, and they need to be in these conversations and in the conversation about whatever model comes forward. And maybe that is softball and football aren't together anymore. I think that's okay. As long as we can give both athletes, both teams a great experience where they are able, if we're going to continue to have it tethered to education, where they are able to get the education they want. They're not clustered into majors that they don't really care about, that they're able to have great athletic coaching and coaches that don't exploit them or take advantage of them. I think that there's certainly ways around this. I do think the NCAA will exist. I think the Power Four is going to continue to gain that power, often, I think, because of the money that's in the Power Four. So it'll be interesting to see how those leaders come to value the athletes in their leagues, which, again, I think is the most important thing. And obviously the point I wanted to drive home here towards the end of this, but.
Right. And you mentioned, that the athlete voice issue, and you mentioned Chase Griffin. There have been 62 witness slots over these 4 hearings, and he was the first Power 5 football or men's and women's basketball player who testified. And his testimony, in my judgment, was more effective than most of the other witnesses. He leaned into American values. He leaned into economic freedom and not having the heavy hand of government come in to run college sports or control the compensation pieces. And I wondered if Caitlin Clark or Angel Reese or Livy Dunn had testified, what does the discussion look like? If those athletes testified earlier in the 4-year debate, what does that look like in terms of these equity themes and the messaging, the very thing that you have researched, and how people feel about the NIL market, how people feel about college sports? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I don't know how much different it looks because I don't know how much people are really leaning into those. I think the bills might look a little bit different, but I also think there's that self-interest that politicians have to serve their states and things of that self-interest and the interests of their states that would prevent them from maybe changing so much. But I think maybe the general discourse around it would be different. I don't think we'd be seeing them necessarily as money-hungry kids quite as much. I think there would be more understanding of there are different levels of athletes, that not everyone's an Angel Reese, a Livy Dunn, a Chase Griffin. And I'm happy that other athletes have been able to testify, but it seems to have really swayed heavily towards the historically what we would classify as non-revenue or non-profit sports, which their experiences are valuable as well. And that those are the majority of the NCAA. But what people care about, to be honest, are football and men's basketball, and now more women's basketball and a few other women's sports. I want their voices. I want to know what they want and what they need about NIL. And who knows what they would say? We don't know. And I really think that's a missed opportunity. The fact that it took 6 hearings to even get athletes to testify in the first place is a disgrace. You just have a bunch of adults testifying on behalf of kids, and you don't want to give the kids the platform that they deserve and that they should have. And NIL's not affecting, gosh, they had a former Miami quarterback from like the 80s testify. I'm like, NIL's not affecting him. Why is he testifying? Why is this man here? Or a former athletics director. So many of them testify. I'm like, he's retired. Get somebody who like this can actually impact right here, right now.
I've looked at the lobbying effort, and I think that's a big piece of how these witness lists have looked like. So I want to one last substantive point, and then I want to talk a little bit about what you see for yourself in the future. You also, in this ideological messaging, there was a lot of discussion about the NCAA's educational purpose. They leaned into education and do that again and again and again, and they're still doing it. And the student athlete sort of symbolically incorporates that. How do you see that now going forward, given the way that the market's changing? And I think that most Americans see this as a commercial enterprise, not as an primarily educational enterprise. How do you think that messaging is going to work going forward?
Yeah, I think it'll start to dissipate. At the beginning, too, the NCAA was very keen on mentioning NIL must be tied to education. That was found throughout the documents and statements that were made. And lo and behold, it wasn't ever really that tied to education. You have a few bills and a few policies that say, hey, athletes need to take X number of seminars to get NIL money or whatever it is. I think my training in higher ed and my passion for sports, I would love for that educational piece to still be maintained. But the relationship between education and higher ed and sport has always been tenuous and always been strained and honestly a little bit fraudulent. And that goes back to the 18 and 1900s. This is nothing new. It's more commercialized. It's a bigger, brighter stage. So we're able to shine a light on maybe the less academic happenings surrounding college or amateur sport and the student athlete. I think there's a way to keep them maintained. I don't know if that looks like changing athlete schedules and things like that, or if it looks like a corporation that is just somewhat attached to a university. Gators, I play for Gators Inc. That is an affiliate with the University of Florida or something along those lines. Again, my preference would be something related to education, but my real preference is what's best for the athletes, what's going to prepare them for life after sport too, because we know sport, it doesn't last forever. So I think there needs to be some type of model. And again, I happen to think the people running the NCAA and the people in higher education and the advocates are smart enough to solve this and create a model. They're just haven't all been in the same room yet. So.
Yeah. Well, the incentive systems aren't aligned for them to do the right thing, unfortunately.
Yes, that self-interest is quite high.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what Professor Harry's going to be doing in the short term and the long term. And do you see your scholarship evolving now that you're moving back to the University of Florida? Do you want to concentrate in these values-based college sports issues? Do you have other interests outside of that? And where do you see your scholarship in 5-10 years?
Yeah. So my scholarship, the 2 lines I think will stay the same, examining the NCAA or whatever governing body exists, institutions and athletics departments, their relationship with each other, and then how that relationship influences the experience of athletes, and then how to make those experience for athletes better and that equitable, more educational, if that ends up being the case, whatever it might be. So staying in those lanes. But I think I'll stay with NIL. I think with the employee status happenings, I'm really excited to dabble into those. Don't be surprised if there's a critical discourse analysis of NLRB hearings and things of that nature. Very excited to see what happens with that. So definitely going to continue that sort of justice equity framework going forward. And I think knowing who's on faculty at the University of Florida and my connections there, I think that'll be very welcomed. Have these conversations. I would love to, again, continue to do NIL. I'd love to do some stuff with collectives if they would welcome me in their doors. Maybe not, but could always give that a try, because I think those are becoming increasingly powerful as well in this space, especially powerful if athletes aren't employees going forward. So we'll see what happens with those collectives there. But I'm definitely going to continue on with these theoretical frameworks that have power dynamics at the center of them, and finding ways to really empower athletes through challenging these historic structures that have arguably disadvantaged a lot of them there. So there's a little bit of other projects, but I don't need to get into the specifics and for the folks listening. But yes, definitely very excited to continue this justice and activism work.
Let me ask you this before we close it out. In the courses that you've taught at Arkansas and what you envision teaching at Florida, do you have many athletes in your classes? And do you have an open dialogue and an open door for athletes to sit down and talk to you and have a resource?
Yeah, I haven't had too many athletes at the University of Arkansas. My classes are during practice times.
Okay.
So I have less of them here. But when I was at UVA, that was something that I found to be really important. I taught a class called Athletics in the University there, and almost every semester, a third to a half of the students were athletes there. And I've received really wonderful feedback from them about thinking more critically about their own experiences and creating a welcoming space to have sort of those tough conversations. And I really think that's probably the most important thing. And that speaks a little bit to the power as well. We don't want athletes considering revenue sharing or what employee status may or may not mean, and the pros and cons of both of those things. And then I come in and I'm like, no, we're going to talk about this for today. So I think that's most important. That's giving them the information. Information is power. And letting them make those decisions for themselves. So I'm a big proponent of having athletes share their perspectives with me, with the class, with whoever they feel comfortable, or even just digesting all these changes. Because again, they're at the center of these changes. They have opinions. They've just been marginalized, silenced in a lot of way with their voices.
Yeah, well, I think what you're doing is so important, Professor Harry, and I look forward to your upcoming scholarship. And I also think it's really important that you're doing it in this Power Four environment and maybe stretch the comfort zone a little bit of some of the more status quo minded people. So I want to thank you for your work and thank you for joining us today. This has been a great discussion.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.